Well, it's the start of a new week here on the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. You know, it was funny. I was looking at some of the stuff we talked about last week. I feel like we got a little too heavy here on the Morning Pitt last week. Like, I was looking back through last week's videos. I have the YouTube page open here on my phone. And, like, yeah, we had the mailbag on Friday. On Wednesday, we talked about how the coaches have rebuilt the wide receiver room. But, like, you know, we're talking about, you know, major changes in the ACC. We're talking about Allen Green. You know, we're digging a little too deep in that stuff. I wrote a lot about the ACC and things like that in the 3-2-1 column on Friday. Like, there's just a lot of things that, I don't know. I just got a little heavier than I don't want to get into that big picture stuff this week. So this week, you know, unless there's like major news that comes out, we're just going to talk some football and some basketball. We're just going to talk some Pitt football. I was thinking about what do we want to talk about for today's Morning Pitt? How do we want to start the week off? And it's just with some football talk. Let's just talk a little bit of Pitt football. Let's set the ACC and the future of college sports and NIL and revenue sharing and all those different things. Just set them aside for a few days, all right? Unless there's a major news event that comes out. And let's just talk a little bit of Pitt football. And to get the week started, I thought a good topic to talk about. 5 guys, and it's going to end up being more than 5, but you'll see why. 5 guys that I just don't think we're talking about enough. 5 guys who are going to be important and relevant to Pitt football in 2025 that I don't think we're talking about enough. I don't know if you want to call them underrated players or overlooked players. I'm going to go with what I just said. 5 guys I don't think we're talking about enough. So let's do that. Let's set aside all this other stuff we've been doing. Let's just talk about 5 guys we're not talking about enough on the Monday edition of the Morning Pitt here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's Monday. It's the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com. You know the website below, Panther-Lair.com. It's the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. Pitt football, basketball, recruiting, transfer portal, all those things. We talk about it every day at Panther-Lair.com. Everything going on in the world of Pitt sports, we've got it for you. Panther-Lair.com and message boards to hang out with other Pitt fans all day, every day. Pitt fans are talking about Pitt sports on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com. It's the best online community of Pitt fans you are going to find. Panther-Lair.com. And of course, right here, this is youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, where we have Pitt video content for you all the time. We have our daily Morning Pits, just like this one that we do Monday through Friday. We have our weekly live show that we do every Wednesday night. We're actually going to move it this week, I think, to Tuesday, but it might be Thursday, but we can't do it Wednesday night. Got something else going on. So we'll have to do it either Tuesday or Thursday. I'll let you know that for sure tomorrow. But that's actually a great example of why you should like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We're going to have a schedule change for the weekly live show. Usually it's Wednesday nights at 8:30. We're going to move it to a different day. You're thinking, oh no, I'm going to miss it. How am I ever going to remember? Simple solution. Subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Turn on the notifications and you can get an alert sent to your phone every time we go live. So you might forget about it, but we will remind you if you subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com and turn on the notifications. So do me a favor, like this video and subscribe. That way you won't miss any of our Pitt video content, and our numbers will look better. We all like the numbers to look better. All right, 5 players we're not talking about enough on the Pitt football team in 2025. 5 guys who are going to be very relevant for Pitt football in 2025, but we're just not talking about them enough. And I'm going to start with a guy who it seems unlikely that I don't think he's underrated. I don't think that's the case. But for a variety of reasons, I just don't think we're talking about him enough. And that's Rashe Biles, junior linebacker, who is, I think most people would probably say, one of the best players on the team, maybe one of the 5 best players on the team, maybe one of the 2 or 3 best players on defense. And yet, I just don't think we're talking about him enough. I think we talk, obviously, a lot about Kyle Lewis returning All-American. I think we've talked about different positions and this and that. And certainly, we've talked a lot about individual players on offense. But somehow Biles seems to be slightly overlooked or slightly forgotten. And now it's hard to say that a guy who had 82 tackles and 15 tackles for loss and 6 sacks last year and a huge pick six to get that thing started against Syracuse. It's hard to say a guy like him is underrated. And I don't think that's the case. I think everyone knows how good he is, but I don't know if we're really thinking about where the ceiling is for Rashe Biles in 2025. For as good as, Kyle Lewis was great last season. I mean, he had a 100 tackle season, 101 tackles, 15 and a half tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 4 interceptions. I mean, he earned every bit of his All-America honors. And if Pitt had done a little bit better in the regular season, if Pitt didn't go, 0-6 down the stretch, if they'd won a respectable amount and gone 9-3 or 10-2 or something like that in the regular season, I have every reason to believe that Kyle Lewis would have been the defensive player of the year in the ACC. But Pitt's slide, as well as, the defensive end from Boston College, was really good. And I understand why he ended up winning it. But, Lewis was very well on his way toward that award and probably even many more, if not, Pitt's late season slide certainly hurt things. But the interesting thing is, Kyle Lewis averaged better than 7 tackles per game in his 13 games. Rashe Biles had 82 tackles, so almost 20 fewer than Lewis, but he also only played 12 games. And he averaged 6.8 tackles per game, so just a little bit less, about less than 1 tackle less per game than Kyle Lewis had. Biles had 15 tackles for loss. Lewis had 15 and a half. Biles actually averaged more tackles for loss per game and more sacks per game than Kyle Lewis did. Now, I don't say any of this to take anything away from Kyle Lewis. I say it to offer major praise to Rashe Biles of how good he is, how good he can be, and where I think the ceiling really is. He led Pitt in pass breakups last year, officially had 3 quarterback hurries, a fumble recovery, a forced fumble, bringing up the defensive stats on Pro Football Focus here. Real quick, Biles had 16 pressures according to Pro Football Focus. Just was one of the best overall players. And actually, if you look on Pro Football Focus, and we could talk, we could spend a long time debating about Pro Football Focus's grades and all that kind of thing. But for whatever stock you put in their grades, Rashe Biles was second on the team in the overall defensive grade behind Kyle Lewis. Kyle Lewis has an 83.4. Rashe Biles has an 82.9. So, you're talking about a difference of 0.5. Nobody else on the defense last season was over 80. And that includes guys who, Davin Bruton played 6 snaps, or Nick Lappy played 38 snaps. So even not even worrying about sample size or adjusting for that, you still have, Lewis and Biles at the top and then everybody else by a wide gulf. The space between Biles and whoever's the next highest rated guy who played a lot, whether it's Francis Brew or Donovan McMillan or whoever, that gap is much bigger than the gap between Lewis and Biles. And I think there are parts of Biles' game. I think there are parts of his physical abilities and traits and intangibles that you would say you could make a case that he might have a higher ceiling than Kyle Lewis. And again, none of this is to disparage Kyle Lewis. Rather, it's to praise Rashe Biles and how good he can be and how good he looks like he can be and how good he was last year. He was really good last season. He just happened to get overshadowed by an All-American. Now, I don't expect Kyle Lewis to take a step back in 2025. Interceptions, we'll see if he can come up with 4 interceptions. Again, some of that is making sure you're in the right place at the right time. Some of that is just getting lucky and the opportunity presented itself. You got to be able to capitalize when that opportunity comes. Some of it is just a matter of opportunity. But I think Kyle Lewis will be even better in 25 than he was in 24. I think Rashe Biles will be even better in 2025 than he was in 2024. And he has a chance, I think, to maybe take an even bigger leap than Kyle Lewis, which would be pretty damn impressive. I don't think we're, when we talk about the real studs and playmakers on this team, I think Biles is definitely in that category. And quite frankly, if you're going to rank the best players on the team, the top 3, and you can order them however you want, but the top 3 are Kyle Lewis, Rashe Biles, and Desmond Reed. Maybe in that order, maybe not in that order. But those are the 3 best overall players on this team as it stands right now. And I don't think Biles is number 3. I'm pretty sure he's in that top 2. So we should probably talk about him a little bit more. Another guy that I don't think we're talking about enough, and I'm not going to have as much to say about this guy as I did about Rashe Biles, but another guy we're not talking about enough, in my opinion, is Jake Overman. Gavin Bartholomew is, he's done. He graduates. Jake Renda goes in the transfer portal. Maybe makes a difference, maybe doesn't. But last year, Gavin Bartholomew caught 38 passes for 322 yards and 4 touchdowns. We don't need to haggle over whether that was adequate usage or not anymore. We've beat that one to death, and we can be done. But somebody is going to have to fill that void. I mean, that's 40 catches, 300-plus yards, 4 touchdowns. Overman last year had 17 catches for 160 and a touchdown. I don't expect this to be a tight end heavy offense. This isn't going to be the kind of offense, this isn't like Notre Dame featuring the tight end or Penn State featuring the tight end or anything like that, because Jake Overman's not those guys. He's not a Notre Dame tight end. He's not Tyler Warren, Penn State or anything like that. He's Jake Overman, and that's fine. But not all of those, 40 catches from Gavin Bartholomew and 300 yards and 4 touchdowns are all just going to be spread among receivers and running backs. The tight ends are still going to have a role here. The tight ends are still going to be involved as pass catchers. And I think, I've said this many times since last season, I think Jake Overman is a useful pass catcher, probably more useful than we've given him credit for over the course, prior to him arriving at Pitt and then once he got here and got on the field. I think he's going to step into that role. I think he's going to play a lot. I think he's going to be the primary tight end, the number 1 guy on the field, and I think he'll probably lead the position group in catches. I might have thought Malachi Thomas was the dark horse candidate there, but he didn't have a very good spring game, and so that's a bit of a tougher sell. Jake Overman, though, I think will have to step up and fill some of that void for tight end receptions and receiving yards and receiving touchdowns. Some of that void that's left by Gavin Bartholomew. And I just don't think we're talking about him. I think we've talked a lot about the wide receivers. Obviously, we talk every day and every week about the running backs and about what that room looks like. But I think the tight ends are an interesting case. And I think that, Overman, I think, is going to have to step up his production. And I don't think we talk about him as being really a factor in this offense as much as we talk about, understandably, Kenny Johnson, Desmond Reed, and so on and so forth. But Overman is going to have a role. Somebody's going to have to fill some of that void at tight end production, and I think it'll be him. I also don't think we talk enough about the defensive ends, and this one is a little bit surprising to me. I think there should be or would be more interest in these guys, or I would expect there to be more interest in these guys simply because it was such a weakness last year. It's interesting. I was like, I'll put together some stats for this, and I was like, when I want to make my case about why the defensive ends, it's so important and why we should be talking about them more, I'm going to point out how low Pitt was in the ACC in sacks last year, how they were bottom of the conference because the D ends didn't get anything. Well, I was right. The defensive ends didn't get anything, but Pitt was actually 4th in the ACC in total sacks. They had 41 team sacks last year, 4th most in the conference. The problem, and why it's relevant here to talk about the defensive ends, is 20 out of those 41 came from linebackers. Nearly half of the team's sacks came from linebackers. Only 15 of Pitt's 41 team sacks came from defensive ends. That's the problem. And if there was a weakness of the defense, if it was an area of the defense that wasn't good enough, it was an area of the defense that held the team back, it was a lack of a pass rush from the defensive ends. And we know the coaches tried last year. They brought in 3 transfers with Nate Matlack and Chief Borders and David Ojebwe, and those guys all together combined for about 6 or 7 sacks. This year, they're trying again. They brought in 3 more transfers. Blaine Spires from Utah State and Joey Zielinski from Eastern Michigan and Jaden Moore from Oregon. I think those guys will combine for more than 7 sacks. Now, we didn't really see those guys much in the spring game. There were some injuries and just sort of limited participation. But I think these are really important players that we should be talking about more. And they're important because the pass rush has to get better this season. And those guys are going to be a big part of the reason why. And so I'm not even picking one individual player here. It's all 3 of those transfers. Plus Jimmy Scott, who's coming back. But especially the transfers. The transfers are going to have to make a big impact at defensive end this year. because of how important, how much they need an improved pass rush, and they're going to need it from the ends. Similarly, I would move inside for number 4 here, the defensive tackles. We talk about them, we reference them, we say their names, but I don't think we talk about how important they are and how good they might be. I think there's a real chance this year for that position group to take a big jump forward. Randy Bates praised them like crazy in the spring, said he thinks the defensive tackles are going to be really good. And I tend to agree. Sean Fitzsimmons and Nick James and Isaiah Neal and Francis Brew and Jasir Whittington. I think those 5 can be really good. Really good. I mean, 4 out of those 5 are former 4-star prospects. Now, that's something we sort of beat to death last summer, talking about how the defensive tackles were all former 4-stars. And we were including Elliott Donald and Nakai Johnson there. We don't talk about those guys as much because they've transferred and left and didn't really produce much last season anyway. So the former 4-star thing may or may not matter all that much. But I think there's a lot of talent. I think Nick James is a talented guy. I think Sean Fitzsimmons is a talented guy. I think Isaiah Neal and Francis Brew and Jasir Whittington are all really talented players. And I think you're going to see some of that really come to fruition this year. You're going to get an improved pass rush off the edge from the defensive ends, and I think the defensive tackles will get a better push than they have probably since Kalijah Kancey was here. So basically a better push than they got in 23 and 24. But I just don't feel like we're talking about that enough. I don't feel like we're giving enough credence to how good those defensive tackles have a chance to be, because I think they've got a chance to be really good. And then the last guy that we don't really talk about much, and I probably understand why, it's not a glamorous position, but we don't talk much about Lyndon Cooper. Lyndon Cooper, I had some stats up here, but I just closed it because I wanted to look at the defensive stuff. Lyndon Cooper, where is it? Lyndon Cooper was 7th among Pitt's offensive linemen last season in pressures allowed. 7th. They only start 5 guys. He was 7th in pressures allowed behind guys who only started 1 or 2 games. Like Isaiah Montgomery played in 5 games on offense last season and allowed more pressures than Lyndon Cooper. Terrence Enos played in 9 games on offense last season and allowed more pressures than Lyndon Cooper. Ryan Jacoby played in 10 games last season and allowed more pressures than Lyndon Cooper. Jason Collier played in 12 games last season, just like Lyndon Cooper did, and allowed more pressures than Cooper. Some of this is about, being the center. Your pass rush comes off the edge. You don't get as much pressure up the middle, and you're not having to block, or how much the pass rush was really coming at you, in terms of a true pass set. He was, he got a decent amount of snaps, was blocking in a true pass set, probably 3rd most on the team behind Ryan Baer and BJ Williams, the other guys who played all the time. And Baer and Williams actually played all 13 games. Cooper missed a game. But when you look at his stats, you look at Pro Football Focus as they chart how you did when teams pass rushed you and how you did when you were actually blocking a pass rush, Cooper's as effective as anybody. As effective as anybody. I think Pro Football Focus says he allowed 12 total pressures all season, so about 1 per game, 2 total sacks all season, and one of the highest efficiency rating of any of the offensive linemen in terms of pass blocking. And I don't think we talk about that enough. He was pretty reliable as a snapper. I think when they actually had to go to Terrence Moore in, I think it was the Clemson game, I think not just the snapping, but the cadence and things like that kind of caused some of those false start issues that they had down near the goal line in that game. But Cooper's really solid as a snapper. He knows the offense. He can handle the cadence well. And he does a pretty good job at making sure the pressure doesn't come up the middle in the quarterback's face. You can't always sort of compare those counting stats of those counting pass block stats like sacks allowed and pressures allowed. You can't always compare those with the center and a tackle and so on and so forth. But, I do think they're worth noting that Lyndon Cooper was pretty effective as a pass blocker, really effective as a pass blocker. And I don't think we talk a lot about Bear. We talk a lot about the 3 transfer offensive linemen, who's going to line up at the tackle spots, how's the depth filling out and everything like that. But I think they found a really solid center in Lyndon Cooper when he transferred in from NC State last season. Did a nice job last year, and I think he'll finish his career with another really nice season this year. We probably should give a little bit more credit to Lyndon Cooper for the solidifying force, the stabilizing force that he is in the middle of the offensive line. So there's a handful of guys that I don't think we're talking about enough. Of course, I talk about this stuff every day. So you tell me, who are we not talking about enough on this Pitt football team, for good or bad? Maybe there's some guys that are a big concern that you feel like we're not talking about enough. Put it in the comments here or put it on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com. That's probably the best way to get an interaction and a conversation is if you go to the message boards and post about it there. So what do you think? Who are guys we are not talking about enough? Let's hear from you. All right, make sure you like this video and subscribe, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you never miss any of our Pitt video content. Thanks so much for tuning in today. I hope you had a great weekend. Enjoy your Monday, and we'll catch up with you tomorrow for more Pitt football talk, unless some news breaks, right here on the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.